So let's go to other items that we should have in the data build
Sure.
out.
Yeah.
We also have to do the legal,
Mm-hmm.
the bylaws, the articles of incorporation. I have had in the last year and a half, I've had 2 instances where the entity was formed by a non-lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
and like an accounting firm said, "Oh yeah, we'll file your articles." Or one case it was a bookkeeper, and the other case was an accounting firm, and there was no conveyance by the person who did the articles of organization. So let's say I do the articles of organization. What I do is I sign off, I send it in, I submit it. Government thinks it's me,
Okay.
and then what I do then is I do a resignation
Mm-hmm.
and transfer. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just a little short page. That's
Mm-hmm.
critical to an institutional buyer's deal. So on one of the instances, we actually had to threaten to sue the person who did it 26 years before,
Yeah, right, because you never conveyed. Yeah.
because they never conveyed. She had retired. God, it took us forever to find her. And when we finally found her, we're like, oh, we just need you to sign this one document. This was a $28 million transaction.
Okay.
If this wasn't chump change, we really
Yeah.
need you to do this. And she's like, you know what? I just don't want to get involved. I haven't worked for that accounting firm in 15 years. I can't remember. It was longer than 15 years, but it was some big period of time. And I just really don't want to get involved. It's like, well, you got to, like,
Yeah.
no, I'm not going to. Like, okay, well, then we have to sue you. I don't want to
Right.
sue you, but we have to sue
Right.
you. So you got to
Right.
get that piece in order. You got to get your cap table in order.
Mm-hmm.
This happens oftentimes where people will say, I've got this key employee here. I promised him I'd give him 10% ownership. I've never papered it. We treat it like he's a 10% owner. It's like, yeah, you know what? Strategic or institutional, they don't like that.
Yeah.
You got to get that all taken care of. You got to get your
Mm-hmm.
corporate minutes taken care of that
Mm-hmm.
show that you actually treat this seriously and you take your business seriously. And so that is a big piece.
Mm-hmm.
Other due diligence items. From employee perspective, you want to get their name. You want to get them signed on a contract, employment contract. You want to have a ledger of their title, their position, their hire date, their base comp, um, their percentage of increase, their commissions, their bonus, anything incentive based that you've put in front of them. You want to get your fringe benefits put together. Um, you want to I'm thinking like a spreadsheet. I'm sure you've done it as a
Yeah.
spreadsheet in your due diligence.
Yeah.
So why not create that spreadsheet now
Mm-hmm.
and just manage the spreadsheet? You want
Mm-hmm.
them. You want an indication of whether they're full-time or part-time, whether they're exempt or
Yeah.
non-exempt,
Yeah.
if there are retirement plans, eligibility,
Mm-hmm.
participation, if you have stock options for them or synthetic equity, you have, check the box type of thing on that. Commission pieces, even what buyers do not want to hear are unwritten compensation mechanisms that talk about how they are going to be paid based upon A, B, and C. They don't like to see that.
Mm-hmm.
They want to see everything recorded.
Yeah. Agreed.
What
Um,
other things do you see?
I think so. One of the things that I really look for is a very solid accounting of the history that they have with any client. So I want to see all the clients that they have and how long, when they were first onboarded, what was their revenue from that client per seat over time, when did that client, if it rolled off, when did it roll off? So I want that entire history. And then what I'll do is I'll form from there like a detailed analysis of your churn rate, for example. Like I will look at their churn rates based on that.
Yeah.
um you know but If they've done acquisitions, then I'd like to see, okay, if there is a certain amount of growth that happened in a certain year, well, you did an acquisition in that year, which is why that growth happened. So I want to know how much of that is organic versus inorganic growth. So all that. I want to see also the assignment of these clients to whoever was the dedicated salesperson for that client. So I'd like to get a sense for, okay, who are the salespeople who are actually performing, or hitting their numbers or doing really well and bringing new business versus people who are not, because that becomes something that eventually comes up, in terms of like, well, these are key people, you want to keep them on versus these are not performing people, and you might want to think about what you want to do with them.
Litigation history, we want to have that. So whenever that's an easy one, but whenever there's a lawsuit or a claim, you have a sheet that records that. Your buyer's going to want to see insurance policies. So you'll get deck pages come in. Why not just take that deck page and put it in the data room that Matter builds for you 3 years before you go to market? Warranty claims, not very common, but you want to do that. Data breaches, that's another thing that we want to log and have a history of. That what I forgot to mention, buyers want to see in your MSA that you will not pay any ransomware. There'll be sales tax pieces. If you're doing work in other jurisdictions, they want to see evidence that you're complying. You've done your foreign filing in those jurisdictions. So why not take care of that now?
Let's talk a little bit about deal closing, because you just mentioned it. What are some of the final legal steps that are involved in closing an MSP sale? And what are some of the most common legal issues you see at closing?
Yeah. So we have moved from an environment 20 years ago where we did purchase agreements, then due diligence, and then if everything went well, it'd be 90 days of due diligence, and then they would do a closing. And we've switched. And before the purchase agreement and the due diligence, before you would do this letter of intent, and then you would negotiate the purchase agreement, kind of like when you buy a house. So it's moved from that to where we do this non-binding letter of intent to this, we're signing everything, and we're going to do some of our due diligence afterwards. And so that's when we have like indemnification escrows put in, because some of this stuff we don't know yet, and we want to have a pool of funds set aside. So there'll be some discussion about the terms of that indemnification escrow. The reps that are going into that, some are fundamental, some are standard reps, some are representations relating to like networking capital, which is another idea of, when you go buy a car, if you go to the dealership, if they sell you the car, but there's no gas in it, you're really mad at the dealership. You're like, what are you doing? So normally dealerships sell you a car with a full tank of gas in it. And the same is true when it comes to selling your MSP. You need to sell it with a full tank of gas. And, there's going to be some discussion about what constitutes a full tank of gas. And that's the networking capital discussion. And so there's a bunch of discussion about that. And then how much are we going to set aside in the indemnification escrow? Is there going to be a separate adjustment escrow for networking capital? So that piece is all a part of the discussion at the very end. If it's a rollover deal where the seller is going to roll a part of their interest in with the buyer, like in a private equity group setting, that rollover due diligence and the transaction documents normally happens in the last 5 or 6 days, and it's brutal. I mean, it's the buyer is looking, the buyer, which is normally private equity backed, is saying, we're going to expose you to a vast amount of deal fatigue and make you just say yes to everything. And that's what happens kind of at the end is, but the closing, it is a hard close, but it's really kind of soft from a due diligence standpoint because there are protections now built in for the buyer in these indemnification.
Any non-compete, non-solicitation agreements that sellers should pay attention to after the sale?
Yeah, so the seller should want, so there's this concept of 125, and from the date of the sale should be 5 years for a non-compete. And that's probably going to be you probably can't go too much more than that. That's going to be enforced, especially if you limit it to the geography that they occupy, that the
Yeah.
business occupies, and or it's going to be more stronger if you do and the clients that are being served. So I think you got to do both, but so that's a 5-year deal from the date of the sale. 2 years, if you're going to be employed by them doing any sort of consulting, it should be at least 2 years from the termination of that employment. So if they work for the buyer for 5 years and they go, hey, look, my non-compete's over. I worked for 5 years, 5 years have passed since the sale date. And because you were employed for 5 years by the buyer, you still got to wait 2 more. So
2
that's
more years. Yeah.
the greater of. And then the 1 year is normally a non-solicitation of employees of buyer. At any time, you're not going to solicit them for at least a year to do anything else. Whether it's in the industry or outside the industry. So let's say you said you're not going to compete in New York and you decide to go to New Jersey and open up your MSP, which would not be violative of your non-compete. You still can't pull employees away for a year under the non-solicit.
Yeah. Yeah. How tightly do you see the region being defined?
Normally by state.
Yeah.
And by customer, but normally it's state. But
Yeah.
I like to have the customer piece put in there too, because if a judge says, I think the state is too broad,
Yeah.
the judge is not going to be able to say that the customer list is too broad.
Right. It is what it is. Yeah.
It is.
Thomas, thank you so much for a really incredible conversation. I really appreciate it. I think this was very, very useful. Insights on the legal side. I think my audience would really love to hear that. So I appreciate it. And I hope to stay in touch and maybe do another one of these in the not too distant future.
Sounds great. Thank you, my friend.